Here's the turn in front of the water heater. Now I've already started to lay some sub-road bed and road bed here, as you can see from the strips in front of you, but the turn goes around like this, and I'm going to continue on laying some track in this area as part of this video diary. Now turn does about 180 degrees around one part of one end of the basement and ends approximately here. Hi. Coming off the Cheat River Bridge here, it may be difficult to see, but I have two levels of roadbed here. Cork, and then covering that Woodland Scenics foam roadbed. The reason why I did this is the Baltimore and Ohio going across the Alleghenies had a very deep ballast profile, which I want to reproduce. So I used cork because it's inexpensive, and Woodland Scenics because supposedly it's quiet. Well, I read the recent issue of Model Railroaders Building Realistic Track, and in there a gentleman named Kingsnorth tested a whole bunch of combination of different roadbeds put together with the intent of making the roadbed quiet. And he tested the cork over the Woodland Scenics. And while he didn't rate this one as quiet as cork over topper tape, I have the Woodland Scenics. I have a little bit more of it to use up. So here I've made the transition between Woodland Scenics over cork to cork over Woodland Scenics. Now here's the Woodland Scenic lower layer that I put in a few pieces here, and you can see the red line is the center line of the track. Now you may be able to make out a double red line. Don't know how this 640 by 480 video is going to come out, but if you see a double red center line, that's because this piece of roadbed is on the easement between the tangent coming off the bridge and the circular curves at this end of the basement, and I'm following the easement red line and not the circular curve red line. Anyway, this sub road bed was put down with adhesive caulk, which you can see right here. It's the DAP Quick Seal adhesive caulk, and I used a clear so that I don't have any unwanted colors in my road bed. And of course, a little bit further back from this, I've also have down the cork coming along behind it, and again glued down on top with the DAP adhesive caulk. Okay, now we're going to talk about laying track. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on laying track. All I do is use the techniques I've read about in various magazine articles. I'm going to leave the expert role for the magazine editors. But I'm doing this for those of you who have read the articles as I have and haven't gotten around to laying your own track, so you can visually see how I do it. And this is just how I do it. I do a couple of quirky things that you might find helpful, but other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Now, what we're going to lay first here is the first layer of roadbed. And for that, we're going to use Woodland Scenics foam roadbed. It comes in these 2-foot strips, and I like the strips for use on turns, curves, because I want to lay my curves to the center line, especially in an area like this. Right here, we're in the easement. As the easement transitions into the circular curve, which occurs right here on both of these tracks. So I'm going to be laying the track to the center line, which represents the easement, and not the center line, which represents the circular curve. Also, I lay all of my track on curves to the center line. So the center line, by using the center line, you'll have a visible center line in the Woodland Scenic roadbed, and then when the cork comes over on top of this, you'll have a center line in the cork, and then you can use that center line to lay the flex track that will follow. And in this way, you'll have smooth, kink-free curves through your easements and into the circular curve. Now, to do that, you have to cut these strips into 2 pieces like this, and then lay a piece on each side of the center line using the center line as your reference. To do that, you take this strip, and on the back of it there is a groove. If you bend it, you can see this groove here. Use a sharp utility knife, an X-Acto knife, something that's very sharp, to get in there and cut the strip in half. Now, if you don't use something sharp, as you can see here, you're going to get ragged edges. Okay, now the Woodland Scenics also comes in a roll form. The roll form I find is very good for straightaways. I don't like it so much on curves. You can cut it and split it in half, but it's a little bit more difficult. It doesn't bend as readily as the strips do when they're cut in half. So I leave this for straightaways. We're also going to use a few other tools. We're going to use the DAP adhesive caulk that I spoke about earlier in clear. We'll use a putty knife. Now I like the disposable putty knives because when this thing becomes too crudted up, you just throw it away, and they're about 50 cents each. We're going to use thumbtacks to hold the Woodland Scenics roadbed in place while the caulk dries. Now, if you read some of the articles written by the guys in HO, they say the the DAP caulk has enough tackiness to hold the roadbed and the track in place while it dries. I don't find that to be the case with using the larger, springier O-scale roadbed or track. So let's get started. Okay, now let's get started. Now I have my first piece of roadbed here, which has been split, and normally I'd work on the outside track first and then work on the inside track, so I won't have to work over work I've already done. But to keep it close to the camera and clear, I'm going to work on the inside track first. So what do? We take our first section of roadbed and do a test fit along the center line like this, and then I'm going to come way over here to the right, which may be off camera for you, and mark as far as the roadbed goes so I know how far to spread the caulk. Okay, now and do the same for the outside strip, but first what I want to do is take a little bit of a snip outside of that outside strip, as I'm doing here. Okay, and the reason for that is, as you can probably see over here, as the the foam roadbed goes around the turn, the outside strip has to go a slightly longer distance than the inside strip, and it comes up shorter. Well, we want to accentuate that. Okay, we do not want our joint in the roadbed to be in one spot. I want these joints to be staggered so that the outer half of the roadbed will have a joint here, and then the inner half will have a joint here. By taking a small cut out of that outer piece, it's going to accentuate that difference in the roadbed and make sure that those joints don't line up in the same place. Now, why is that important? Read somewhere many years ago, you don't want joints in your sub roadbed, that is your plywood, and your roadbed and your track anytime any two of those aligning, and certainly not all three at any given time, because there'll tend to be flexure and movement at the joints, and if they all line up, then you're going to get irregular track for sure. So okay, so we've snipped this piece. We're going to test fit it to the center line. We're going to mark out here how far it goes, and the next step will be laying out the caulk. Okay, now down to work. You probably can't see it, but in addition to the red center line of the track, I also have my beam compass, which I use to lay out turns, also draws these green lines which indicate the left and right edges of the roadbed. So that gives me a guideline to which to lay my caulk. And over here is my end line for the outer piece of roadbed, how far it's going to come. So I take my caulk, and I'm going to lay out a bead here. Now, I probably, like everything else, I use too much of everything. You probably don't even need a bead that large. You probably only need a skim coat of this stuff. However, I did read in the recent model railroad they're laying realistic track that adding a little bit of the extra caulk gives us tiny extra amount of sound deadening. Not a big deal. This caulk is not inexpensive, so you probably want to use the minimal possible. Anyway, we've got laid out, and now I'm going to come along, and it's going to be a little awkward because I want to be standing where the camera is. and I really can't work left-handed. I'm going to spread the caulk till I get it evenly between the red line, the center line, and my green lines out here at the end of the roadbed. And I don't want to cover my center line because I need to see that to know how to line the roadbed. But I'm going to do that here for this first section, and make sure I have nice evenly spread caulk. Actually, this did turn out a little bit thin. I'm going to put a little bit more over here. I also put a little bit more where two sections join, just to make sure that those sections are really glued down. Okay, because again, you don't want movement. You want to do everything you can to avoid movement at the joint between two sections of the roadbed or the sub-roadbed. So now I'm laying this out. I did cover my center line here a little, so let me clear that away. I'm going to lay this out to the center line of the easement as we move into the circular curve. Okay, so now I want to make sure that this joint is tight. Don't stretch this foam too much or it will have an irregular thickness, and you want to avoid that if at all possible. So I'm stretching it a little bit here to make sure that the joint is tight, but you have to be very careful in doing that. So once you're satisfied that this piece of roadbed is on the center line, then what I do is I take thumbtacks and I push them in and into the plywood. Now that's a little bit tough. It takes a nice strong thumb, but I'm going to come along and push these in at intervals of say 3 or 4 inches. Again, I probably do more than is necessary. I'm going to push these in at intervals of 3 or 4 inches, and again to hold the roadbed in place while the glue dries. Now again, at the end, I'm going to make sure, extra sure, I have it taut there and really press down into the glue, because you don't want the roadbed to flex. Now I'm going to let this dry over a few hours or overnight at most, and then I'm going to get these thumbtacks out of here. The reason is these thumbtacks can leave indentations in the foam roadbed if left there too long. Now that I'm using the Woodland Scenics as the layer under the cork, that's probably not a big deal. But if you use your Woodland Scenics directly onto the plywood or on top of the cork, you don't want indentations along the Woodland Scenics, because again, that could cause irregularity in your track. Unlikely given the thickness of O-scale track, but why take a chance? Okay, now we're going to come along and do the inside strip of foam. This one's a little bit easier because once you have the main strip of foam in place, you have something to work against, both to work the caulk against and to work the strip against. Okay, so we put our bead of caulk down, and again, this is going to be even more awkward because I want to be working where the camera is, but we're going to spread that out till it fills up between the center line, and of course now you don't have to worry about the center line. You can cover it even a little bit, and the line that indicates the edge of the roadbed. I'm doing a really sloppy job here, but great precision isn't called for right now. Okay, so I've got this spread out. Get it off my putty knife where it's not doing me any good. It has to be on the plywood to do some good. Again, a little extra squirt at the joint here between the previous section and the new section, just to make sure that that area is very thoroughly glued down. Okay, so we're set to go. I'm going to put a little here on this edge, which I believe, yep, is off camera. So you can't see what I'm doing here, but again, at the end of the strip, I want to make sure that there's a goodly amount of glue, of caulk, so that it stays put at the end. You don't want those ends moving and potentially causing a irregularity there, a kink in the track. Okay, so now we take our second strip, and this one becomes very simple because now you just push it into place against the first strip. You don't have to worry so much about the center line. It'll take care of itself. You do want to make sure that if you have a nice, good, sharp cut between these two pieces of foam roadbed, you can actually, the center line can actually disappear and you won't be able to see it. So you don't want to quite push it again together that hard again, because I preserve that center line so I can see it in subsequent layers and track laying. Okay, so again, don't stretch and compress the foam. Use your fingers to make sure that it's about the same height as the other strip, and then start putting in your thumbtacks wherever you wish, at a reasonable interval to hold the strip in place while the caulk dries. Push the thumbtacks through the caulk and down into the plywood. Try not to put any bigger dent in the foam than you need to, and do that till you're satisfied that you have enough to hold it in place. And this section of roadbed is done, and we'll let that dry overnight and then come back and cover it with the cork. Okay, before we go on and lay out the cork roadbed on top of the foam roadbed, I wanted to show you the ends of the sections we just finished. Now, I finished off camera. I finished the outer track portion of this so we could continue. If you remember, we cut back a section of the half of the foam roadbed that goes along the outside of the curve. Now, the reason we did that is to produce this stagger in the joints. We don't want these joints to be equal, because if we do, we're creating a spot where we might get a kink in the track that's going to be laid above it. So we want these joints staggered. It just is going to help prevent an irregularity or the joint in the sub-roadbed from causing a kink in the track. And the reason why we cut back the outer strip is because going around the turn, the outer strip has to travel a slight distance more than the inner strip. And even on generous radius curves like this 64 and this 68-inch radius curve, that difference will come out to be about where my thumb is, maybe ½ an inch on these curves. Now, ½ an inch isn't enough offset. So we cut back the outer one, because if we cut back the inner one, we'd have to cut it back more to get these joints to stagger. So we cut back the outer one. It produces the stagger you see here in these joints, and that will help us make sure that we have smooth track when we finally do get around to laying the track. And one more comment about this stagger before we go on to lay the cork. You only have to do this cutting back of the outer strip once at the beginning of a turn. There and after, you can lay the strips in full length. It'll replicate this stagger every time you put a full-length strip on here. In fact, the outer strip will get shorter and shorter and shorter, increasing this stagger, because of course the outer strip, as we add each additional strip, has a further distance to go than the inner strip. So all you need to do is cut back at the beginning of the curve to create this stagger, and it will self-perpetuate itself all the way around the curve. You don't have to cut every outer strip thereafter. As we start laying our cork, you can see here I've already established the stagger in the cork section. I have my first section of cork down, and I've cut back the outer piece to create the stagger. So as we lay the next section of cork on camera, we won't be cutting the strip, but the stagger has already been established. Now, what we will be doing is making sure that as we lay the strips in, that the cork joints do not line up with the joints in the foam. Okay, now that's helped a little bit by the fact that the foam comes in 2-foot strips and the cork comes in the traditional 3-foot strips. But we're still going to test fit each section of cork to make sure that it doesn't line up with a joint in the foam underneath it or on the strip beside it in the foam. So neither here nor here when we put in the next section of cork. Okay, now we're going to lay our cork roadbed over the foam. Now we have our section here of cork roadbed. This is a 3-foot length. As you can see, it goes considerably off camera in both directions. Now cork separates much more easily than this foam roadbed does. The foam has to be cut fairly carefully with a sharp utility knife or sharp hobby knife, as we mentioned. But the cork roadbed, simply you pull it apart. I'm sure most of you have seen or laid cork roadbed, so this comes as no surprise. You simply pull it apart because it's already serrated in the middle. Now what happens then is you get the beveled edges in the center of the cork, and you simply have to now reverse one of the pieces, lay it next to one another, and you have roadbed which is now beveled on both sides. Now we're going to test fit our outer section first to the sub roadbed again to check to make sure that we don't have alignment of the joints on the upper and lower sections. And coming through here, I can see off camera to my right, or to your right as you're looking at the camera, that it does not have that alignment. So once we've checked this outer section, we're free to go ahead and start laying the cork over the foam. Now, to begin laying the cork, we're going to do exactly as we did before. We're going to begin with a goodly bead of the adhesive caulk, laid in this case on the outer part of the foam roadbed. And I'm continuing off camera here because I have to lay this whole 3-foot section in one fell swoop. We take our putty knife and we're going to spread that, again trying to preserve the center line so that we can see the center line, because again I lay my track to the center line in all cases, not necessarily to the edge of the roadbed. I believe anyway, I don't know if I find yet, but I believe that this gives me smoother curves than would otherwise be. Now, if you accidentally cover your center line, and it's bound to happen, I know I'm certainly not neat enough to bring the caulk up to the center line. I use any pointed object. In this case I have a miniature screwdriver, and I run it down the center line of the roadbed, and that will help reestablish the center line so that you can see it. Now, as before, when we put the foam roadbed in place, we start to fit our cork roadbed to the center line, and we do this carefully. We don't want to push down too much on the foam and cause it to be irregular, but the cork itself is not subject to being distorted as much as the foam is. Now, one of the things you can do, as you can see me working over here, is I get the first piece into the stagger created by the previous section of cork, and I can get that secured with thumbtacks so that it doesn't move around, and it will move around if you're not careful. And then I can go back and assure that my cork is on the center line so that I have a nice smooth curve through this area, and that since I'll be laying my track to my center line, that everything is going to flow. Okay, now off camera I finished putting in the thumbtacks and laying this outside strip. I didn't think that you'd be very interested in watching me push in thumbtacks. But I do want to make an observation. I used relatively a lot of thumbtacks in this outer strip of cork. The cork is fairly stiff. It doesn't readily bend to the curve, so I use rather more thumbtacks with the cork than I do with the foam. Now, in fitting the second strip, I haven't put any glue down yet, as you can see. In fitting the second strip, here's a problem. The edge of the center strip, the center of the edge of the inner cork is almost aligned with the edge of the outer foam, and I don't want these two joints lining up. Even if they're in another level, even if this outer foam piece will be covered by a cork strip when we're done laying the rest of this curve, I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this piece of cork, cut it back probably to about here, so that the joints here, here, and here are all neatly staggered, no two of them lining up in the same place. Okay, now my cork roadbed cut to size. I go through the same drill that we've had before, a goodly sized bead of the adhesive caulk on out to the end where the cork is going to be laid. And then spread it, of course. Now I like to get a little bit extra where the two sections meet, just to make sure that there's going to be no discontinuity there. Spread it out. Now with the cork roadbed in place, this is almost easy. I'm just dragging my putty knife down using the other piece of cork as a guide. I have to get out here off camera where the cork is going to end, and once I've got that and picked up a few spots which seem a little bit thin to me, then we take our cork and we lay it in again tightly up against the other strip. You don't want to push this too much such that you push the other strip out of alignment, but you do want it tight, and start driving in your thumbtacks. Again, checking with your finger that this joint between the two is the minimum that you can, get. You want a minimal ridge, if any ridge, between the two pieces of cork. Now that means, don't push down too hard on the thumbtacks, and check your work as you go. Okay, now off camera I've laid in my inner strip here, and I've made sure that I'm happy with the gap that exists between the two strips. Now to adjust these, sometimes you may have to pull out existing thumbtacks, gently squeeze the cork together, put the thumbtacks back in. You may have to add extra thumbtacks as you gently, and I do mean gently, squeeze these together to close up and smooth out that gap between the strips. So do what you have to do. Pull out existing thumbtacks, only a couple at a time in a small area, because if you pull them all, you're liable to lose the true center line of the curve. Pull out thumbtacks, reposition them, gently squeeze these strips together till that gap closes up, and you can barely, if any, feel it between the two strips of cork. And a final note on our cork here. You can see the stagger in the foam roadbed, and we cut back this strip of cork which was lying right here, about almost dead equal with this end of the foam roadbed. So we cut it back to here. We have this one cut back so that none of these four joints in the foam or in the cork is lying on top of one another, and this should help us guarantee kink-free track as the track gets laid over through this area. Also, another thing that I do, you'll notice here that I have two thumbtacks in the very end of the strip of cork. I do the same thing at the end of the strip of foam, is I want to keep this end very square and in place. Because you're going to be butting the next strip up against either of these four ends, and you want to keep everything square and going around the curve in the true fashion. So I want to make sure that this doesn't shift at all during the time that the caulk is drying. Okay, here we are. Our road bed's almost ready to receive track. As you can see, we have it laid from a tangent there on this end and all the way around the curve and out several feet to approximately there. Now, as you can see, I've laid the rear track already. I used microengineering flex track for that, and microengineering requires a different procedure from what I'm going to show you today with the Atlas Flex. So microengineering doesn't really like to bend around curves, so we'll leave that for another day. Now the road bed's about ready to receive track, but first we're going to have to sand the cork road bed. Now, cork road bed can have discontinuities here, where you see a joint here and a joint here, be minor discontinuities. I like to give it a little bit of sanding just to make sure that the track, when we lay it on top of here, will lay as flat and as smoothly as possible. So I have a sheet of 60 grit sandpaper wrapped around just old piece of 2x4, and what we'll do is we're going to sand the road bed, paying particular attention to the joint that runs down the center and any joints we have in the side. So this doesn't have to be very strenuous. It's just to level out, not completely necessarily, but to level out any discontinuities in the road bed. So just bring it along, do your sanding until we've done the whole section of road bed. Okay, now we're going to start laying some track, but before we do, we have to prepare the sections of track that we're going to lay. I have two sections here of Atlas Flex track. Now, because we're starting this curve here, we're starting from the tangent, you could just take and join these two sections of flex track and interlock these interlocking ties that Atlas has on the base of its rail. For me, however, those ties look really, really bad once the track is laid, because I don't know if you can see here, but they have a U-shaped indent to take the locking pin from the other section of flex track. So what I do is I'm going to cut these off. You don't have to on the first section of the flex track coming off of a straight, because they will be able to interlock and stay that way, but I just don't like the look of them, so I'm going to take some diagonal cutters here and cut off that first section, that first tie on each section of this flex track before we join them together. If I can get my cutters in here, I will anyway. Now that we've gotten these first sections cut off, and you can see that they're not particularly pretty here, we're going to just basically join the flex track in the normal manner. So I'm going to take my needle nose pliers here. I'm going to slide one rail joiner from one section onto the next section, which sometimes with Atlas is a little bit tricky, because Atlas rail joiners have some detents on the bottom that are meant to hold the rail in place, but they can make joining the two sections of rail a little difficult. Now the next thing we have to do, especially on curves, you may want to forego this on straightaways, but especially on curves, is to solder these two sections of track together. The reason being that as the rail bends around the curve, the outer rail has to go a further distance than the inner rail, basic geometry if you can remember back to high school, and so therefore the two rails want to shift relative to one another, and most importantly, at the joints, they will tend to kink if these joints aren't soldered together very, very thoroughly. What I have here is a somewhat ancient Weller pencil soldering iron. Now you can see this is a Weller SP23. I bought this over a decade ago. They still make this iron, and as I found out, they still make the tips for this iron, and I just treated mine to a new tip after 10 years or more. It's a 23 watt iron, and 23 watts seems to be a very good temperature for soldering rail without melting ties. Key things when you're soldering: get your iron hot, be patient, let it heat up till it readily melts solder. Next thing is keep your tip clean. Okay, there's this in my old soldering iron holder here. I keep a wet sponge for that purpose. Clean your tip before making every joint so that it's nice and shiny like you see here. On a new tip, when the tip's brand new, heat it up, put some solder on there to tin it, and it will help it stay clean over the life of the soldering iron. So what we're going to do is we're going to solder these rails from the outside, not the inside, but from on the outside of each rail, and solidify that joint so that it's not going to kink as we bend the rail around the curve. Okay, I've moved in for a close-up now, so hopefully you can see how this is going to happen. So I've got my rail jointers rather centered over the joint. Notice, if you can, I don't know if this is going to be high enough resolution, but I've gotten the square end of the Atlas rail very tightly together so that there's just a very less than paper thin gap between the two rails. So now I'm going to take my soldering iron. If you can hear the sizzling, that's me cleaning the tip, so I'm going in with a nice clean tip. I'm going to take my lead-based solder. For you people who live in Europe and you have to use non-lead solder, this would be a tin-based solder. I'm going to basically get the soldering iron and the rail wet and let the iron transfer heat to the rail. You have to get a good solder joint, you have to have both the solder and the work hot enough to melt the solder. And if you were looking there, the solder starts to flow like water when it's hot, when the work piece and the iron are hot enough. Now I'm going to go back just a little tad bit here on the top of the rail to flow some solder down into the joint between the two rails. And later on, after the track is laid, we're going to sand that. But I'm not going to get anything here on the inside, the gauge side of the rails. And now we have cleaned my soldering iron before I put it back in holder off camera here. Now we have a nice tight joint that I'll clean up later with some sandpaper or file. I'll do the same thing to the outside rail, and we'll be ready to lay this section of track. We're going to begin. This is still pretty much tangent, and the easement begins a little bit about 6 inches off camera to the right. Atlas Flex has holes in the ties. There's one in this tie. And what I do is I align them on the center line of the cork roadbed, and that's why I keep splitting the cork and the woodland scenics or whatever else. And then I take a number 52 drill when it's aligned, when the hole is aligned on the center line, and I drill down through the hole, through the cork and the woodland scenic, and into a little bit into the plywood sub-road bed. Then what I do is I take a number 17 by 1 inch wire brad. I insert that into the hole, and then with the needle nose pliers I drive that brad home. Now the number 52 drill is a loose fit for these brads, and that's intentional, because these brads are only going to hold the track in place while I gradually bend it around the curve, and then they're going to be removed. I'm going to take the track off, spread adhesive caulk, and then replace the track and and then use the brad holes as guides to reposition the track so that it's now smoothly around the curve. But first we're going to lay the rest of this curve with the brads, check it with the NMRA gauge to make sure that everything's engaged. There are no kinks. That's very unlikely with Atlas Flex because it flexes so readily. We'll check that there's no kinks and that everything rolls through smoothly with both the NMRA gauges and trucks and cars and locomotives to make sure that the track is smooth. Then we'll pull the brads, put the glue down, put the brads back, and wait for the glue to dry with the track weighted in place and with the brads guiding them. Okay, I've bent the rail to the curve. I'm taking you here to where we made the joint between the two sections of track just to show you how this works out when you pre-solder your rail. Normally when I'm in a straightaway I use a brad only every other hole in the Atlas Flex track, but here in the easement, this section is in the easement between the straight track over this way and the circular curve to the right. I use a brad in every hole provided in the Atlas Flex track to make sure that the track conforms to the easement that I've drawn on the sub-road bed so that I get smooth transitions to curves. So now I'm going to check this joint with the NMRA track gauge. So I'm pushing this against the far rail, and I'm going to start here. I'm going to pull it through, feeling as I go for kinks and for the fact that this gauge doesn't drop in between the rails, showing that the track is in fact engaged. And except for the solder, which is still on top of these rails, this is a very, very smooth transition. One other thing I can do to check the rails for smoothness is I use this 3-point gauge and pushing it through here, except for again where it binds on the solder joints, it goes through smoothly and without binding. So we know we have a good turn. During the making of this film, I did come across a technique that I'm going to claim for my own. Take your digital camera, put it right down on the rails like the camera is in this shot, and take pictures at various intervals along your rails. Take those pictures back up to your computer, blow them up to full screen or larger, and then look along the rails and make sure that at no place do you see kinks in those pictures. It's the equivalent of getting yourself down to a O-scale size man height and looking along the rails. Okay? It's cheap. The electrons cost you nothing. You can always erase the pictures from your card or from your computer when you're done. And if you see a kink, go back to that spot and work it out. Alright, and here's the end of the rail of just that 6-foot section. And to show you that your geometry teacher did teach you something you would use in later life, you can see the difference because the outer rail had to travel a longer distance because it goes around a slightly larger radius. It comes up short of the inner rail. Just like we talked about in the section on the roadbed where we staggered the joints, this is an automatic staggering of the joints. So we'll continue this on at least through the next section of rail by sliding the outer rail the outside rail further down to when we make this next rail joint. Probably though after about 3 sections we're going to have to cut the rails off with a Dremel tool more or less even because the stagger will become too far to accommodate just by sliding the rails. So you did learn something in geometry class that you're going to use in later life. Okay, we have our track laid, we have our brads in, we've drilled the holes, the brads are holding the track in place. We've checked it with our NMRA gauge and we find that the track is engaged properly. Another gauge you can use is a 3-point gauge, especially on curves. And we check that and make sure that there are no kinks and that the track flows freely. So now, one thing I've done here is I've put a mark, and you can see them here, here, here. I've put a mark next to each tie where there's a brad inserted in the hole in the Atlas Flex Track. If you don't put a brad in every hole, later on we're going to remove these brads next, and we're going to remove the track, and we're going to put the adhesive down, then we're going to put the track back, and we're going to put the brads back into the pre-drilled holes. Now, unless you know where the brads went, have some indication, and that's what these little tick marks are, telling me which ties and which holes have a brad in them, so that I can put the brads back after we remove the track. Okay, now I'm going to remove the brads here, and then I'm going to take this whole 2 sections of track and move it out of the way, move it back and out of the way, or it can move it forward and out of the way. And in fact, I think I will do that, move it forward and out of the way. And then we're going to put adhesive down on the roadbed, put the track back, and restore the brads. So I'm going to remove the brads from this section right here. And as you can see, because the holes were drilled slightly oversized, the brads pull right out, once you get a grip on them, that is. And so I'm pulling them out here with needle nose pliers. There are a couple more over here outside the camera's field of view that I missed. But we're going to now take out all the brads and then move this track out of the way. Okay, so now the track is free, and it is going to move, it is going to bend a little bit out of shape as we move it out of the way, but that's okay. We have the brad holes in there. We have the spots marked where they're going to go, here, here, here. So when we put the track back, we'll have plenty of indications of where it goes back. So next comes the adhesive. Now we have the familiar tools for the adhesive, our putty knife, and I use a disposable putty knife, so if one day I forget to clean it off, it's 30 cents, 40 cents at Home Depot. Since I started this project, I've laid the back track, and I used up all of my tubes of DAP caulk. It also comes in cartridges, and it's obviously much cheaper to buy it in cartridges. So I have the cartridge now, and we'll lay down a fairly thick bead on each half of the sub-road bed, much like this. Spread it with the, I'm capping up the cartridge, we'll spread it with the putty knife till we have a nice even coat. Now again, I put it on probably heavier than most, heavier than is recommended, but that's the way I do things, no half measures. So you get a nice even coat on both halves of the road bed. Not so important now to preserve the center line, because we do have the brad holes to guide us. Now you won't be able to see those brad holes. We're going to feel our way into the holes in the very next step. So now we're about ready to put the track back. Okay, now the track's back in place. It's been glued down, okay, and I put the brads back in, and you can see from here that these brads can go in with finger pressure. You don't need any more than finger pressure. Now to find the holes, you may have to hunt a little bit back and forth, jiggling this tie fore and aft along the center line, but when you find the hole, it goes in very easily. And I just then snug them up just ever so slightly against the ties to put down just a little bit of downward force to hold the tie into the glue. Okay, and now all we have to do is wait for the glue to dry. Okay, I've taken my two pieces of flex track that we just joined, and I've butted them here up against the straight track. That is the beginning of the curve. Now I have my rail joiners here and here centered. Normally and this is my personal practice, I don't solder the joints of straight sections of track. I leave those open, even a tiny little gap in it, about the width of maybe two widths of paper, to allow for expansion joints. However, on a section of straight track which begins a curve, I found that if you don't solder the rail joints here, that you can wind up putting an inadvertent gap into the outside rail. The reason being is, as you tend to bend the rail around, again, the outer rail has to travel further, and it pulls away from the gap, as you might be able to see here. Oh, it's not working. Let's try it again. See, a little gap is appearing as I put a little bit of bend into the rail. Okay, so I've been soldering my rail joints at the beginning of curves. So before you do, take your needle nose pliers, push the rail joints tightly closed, and then apply the same soldering procedure we've just seen. Here's a sweep of the track glued down. You can see the glue is whitish now, but as it dries, that will turn to clear, and it's glued out. It's basically glued down all the way to the end, or almost to the end, as we'll see in the next segment. Now, you'll see how the last 4 inches or so of this track doesn't have any glue. There's some adhesive here, there's no glue here. But I have reinserted the brad so that the track stays to a smooth curve going through. Now, the reason for no glue here is that after the track is dried, I can remove this brad, and I'll do that now, and this track will move out straight, so I can solder the next section on to a straight piece and then continue to bend smoothly around the curve. And that makes your life of attaching the next piece a whole lot easier. We're coming down the home stretch now. Pull out your brads. Track is all glued, everything's in place. Time to pull the brads. The number 52 drill was deliberately drilled a little bit oversized for these brads, so it's time to pull them. They'll be a little bit stiffer than before because they probably have picked up some of the caulk on the second insertion, which holds them in place a little bit, but they pull right out without distorting anything. So we're almost done. Here's a section of track that's been completed. It's been completely glued down. It's at a joint, and we've removed the ties from the joint per the, I've removed the ties from the joint per the technique I've shown you, and now we need to put some ties back. Those ties can either be stained wooden ties like this, or the plastic tie salvaged from another section of track. If you use the tie salvaged from another section of track, scrape off with a knife the molded on spike heads, and then just slide it under the rail like this till the tie plates line up, and it of course will match the existing track. If you want to use the wooden ties, which aren't quite an exact match, they slide under as well, and space them out to your satisfaction, and use a little bit of glue to hold them in place, and now you can't tell that this area was an area that had a joint in it previously. Here's something I've been meaning to try for a while. I have the camera mounted on a flat car, and I'm going to push it slowly around this curve we've just laid, and it's going up at 2% grade at the same time, to let you see as the track comes up in front of you that it's nice and smooth and without kinks. End of track on the outer track, and then effectively end of track on the inner track. Here's the final result. 2 tracks laid smoothly around a near 180-degree curve along the top of the benchwork, and this shot mimics the shot we opened this video diary with, except now that the track is in place.